welcome back to the show. Today we're going to discuss the phrase, do what thou wilt. And in doing so, we go all the way back to late antiquity, the Old Testament, in the Book of Sirach, or otherwise known as Ecclesiasticus. Hey, wait a minute, man, that book's not even in the Bible. Yes, it is. And we're going to discuss that too. Why it was there, why it should be there, when it was taken out, and by whom, and for what reasons. But for the Catholics, that book is still there. From late antiquity, we jump to the late 4th century to St. Augustine and how he used a similar phrase and how it was later perverted and misquoted even to this day. From there, we jump to mid-Renaissance France to a satirical and comical work written by uh, a Catholic priest, actually, named Francois Rabelais. From there, we jump to the late 1800s, early 1900s into the esoteric occult practices of witchcraft and sex magic. From there, we're going to jump to about the 1950s, 1960s, when certain folks became celebrities, and then their practices and use of this term and this thought process um, made its way onto album covers of famous bands, lyrics of famous artists, and mansions. And finally, we're going to end up at the Church of Satan and Anton LaVey. So stay tuned, fasten your seatbelt, and let's roll. All right, before we embark on anything, first things first. In nomine Patri et Filii Spiritus Sancti. Amen. Now, let's get into Ecclesiasticus. We start first with the Revised Standard Version. This is the Catholic edition, but the Revised Standard Version, otherwise still Ecclesiasticus 32:12. And you're going to find different wording here, but we're going to get to that. Amuse yourself there and do what you have in mind, but do not sin through proud speech. Let's go next to the Wycliffe Bible, still there, 32:12, Ecclesiasticus Sirach. And do thy conceits or thy conceivings, that is, perform thy good purpose, conceive there, and not in sins and in a proud word. Let's go now to Dewey Reams, Sirach 32:12. In many things be as if thou wert ignorant, and hear in silence and with all seeking. It's important to understand here that Ecclesiasticus 32:12, Sirach 32, is a book on the instruction of etiquette at a banquet. So, why are these books considered apocrypha? From the King James Bible online, they discuss this. The Apocrypha is a selection of books which were published in the original 1611 King James Bible. These Apocrypha books were positioned between the Old and New Testament. They were part of the King James Version for 274 years until being removed in 1885. That's not that long ago, folks. A portion of these books were called deuterocanonical books by some entities, such as the Catholics. Now, many people back in the day thought that these books should never have been included because they weren't God inspired. Others believed that the books were valid and that they should have never been removed. That is, that it was considered part of the Bible for nearly 2,000 years before it was recently removed a little more than 100 years ago. We're looking at 1885, they're gone. So that's more than 100 years, but really not that long ago. Others claim that the books weren't removed by the church, but rather by printers to cut the costs in distributing Bibles in the United States. So, very interesting speculation here as to why these books were removed. The Dewey Reams still lists them as the Apocrypha. Dewey Reams is the English translation of the Vulgate written by St. Jerome and completed in its entirety by 405 AD, translated directly from the original source documents, that is Hebrew, Aramaic, and from the Septuagint in Greek. Along comes King James Version 1611, long after, 1200 years later. Credit, they also went back to the original source documents and translated directly into English, but they kept these books in between the Old and New Testament as Apocrypha, and it wasn't until 1885 that they were tossed. Now, Luther had his hand in tossing some of these earlier on. And here's a quote from a book, description, and the link is below, all of this stuff. But although Protestants rejected the Apocrypha as canonical Old Testament scripture, there was still considerable disagreement among them as to what to do with these controversial books. Luther rejected 1st and 2nd Ezra, and placed the other apocryphal books in an appendix at the close of the Old Testament, prefacing it with the statement, quote, Apocrypha, that is, books which are not regarded as equal to the Holy Scriptures, and yet are profitable and are good to read. So, I'm not really sure how the Protestants reconcile that with their sola scriptura, especially since these books were absolutely a part of their Bible until 1885, regardless as to whether they were considered inspired or where they were in the middle as an appendix in between the Old and New Testament as Apocrypha. They were there until not too long ago. I want to bring up this King James scripture of Ecclesiasticus 32:12 because it's probably the best interpretation insofar as this is what everybody jumped on and began to pervert and utilize for their own desires. Most especially, do what thou wilt. This has been the phrase over time that's been corrupted and perverted. Let's jump now to Augustine, who writes in Confessions, Thou givest and wilt give me to follow thee willingly, doing what thou wilt. Okay, it's important. You're going to see the consistency through all of these quotes from Confessions by St. Augustine. He's not talking about living the way he wants to live. He's literally talking to God and telling God to do what thy wilt with him, utilize him in whatever manner that God wishes. So that's the first one. More. All in my hope is nowhere but in thy exceeding great mercy. Give what thou enjoinest and enjoin what thou wilt. Thou enjoinest continency. Give me what thou enjoinest, and enjoin what thou wilt. You're never going to see the direct. It's not there. I went through Confessions and I went through City of God. Give what thou enjoinest and enjoin what thou wilt. Finally, another one, and this is all over Confessions, all over the place. Thou givest and wilt give me to follow with thee willingly, doing what thou wilt. Absolutely talking to God, talking about God, to utilize him or whatever. And so when we come across things like this wiki quote, wiki, all right, in the 5th century sermon, Augustine of Hippo gave a similar instruction, love and what thou wilt do. Absolute, all right, first of all, this is either an absolute perversion, a twisting of the context of what Augustine was actually trying to say, or they're just misquoting and misconstruing of what he's actually talking about or to whom he's saying this. Because Augustine's either talking to God to tell God, to do with him what he will, or they're just absolutely perverting and misconstruing this quote whatsoever. But what can be expected from Wiki? I mean, they're evil in their own very essence. So we'll pick this up in a part 2 because this is getting lengthy and there's a lot more to talk about. So we've covered the Apocrypha, we've covered Ecclesiasticus and Sirach, and we've jumped now to uh, Augustine and his Confessions. So we've gotten a baseline, a foundation of the phrase that's been perverted over millennia of do what thou wilt. In the next episode of this, we'll pick up how this was now utilized and perverted even more by a Franciscan Catholic priest who wrote during the Renaissance. Until then, God bless.